Okay, our goal is to, in the next few short minutes, to walk through the story of God, to get a better understanding of what God has done, what God will do, to better find ourselves in His story as well. God's story begins with creation. This outline you can find in your bulletin, and you can fill out those things if you want. Creation doesn't take very long before we get into act number 2, which is rebellion. And it's in our rebellion that God then shows up as our Redeemer. The act of God's redemption actually has 3 different and distinct phases. And the first one is the nation of Israel. Then our hero enters the story, you guessed it, in the person and work of Jesus. And then Jesus launches out and God continues His redemption through the church. But the church isn't the end of the story. The story continues in what we'll call the consummation of all things, when Jesus ultimately returns, and what we might call the ultimate end. So there's the story of God. Let's fill in the details and find ourselves in it. Creation, our understanding of creation, comes from Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. We see in creation that God creates, and He calls His creation good. But interestingly, His creation is not finished. It's into God's good creation that He creates us. And there's a couple of things that we see about the us that God creates. The first is that He says we are very good. And in our very goodness, God creates us with dignity given by Him and purpose. We are a part of God's good plan. We are dropped into His unfinished creation to do our part, to play our role in what God is up to in the world. But again, it doesn't take long. Genesis 3 happens. Genesis 3 is the story, the debate, the look ahead to the consequences, wrapped around this one simple idea. Will we choose to act like God ourselves or trust the one true God? Rebellion enters because we decide to sin. We decide to trust ourselves, to be God and not trust God. Sin then, as we see in their story, and we see it all the time in our story, unravels quickly. The word that maybe describes this the best is brokenness. That things get shattered. In our shatteredness, we see a brokenness between our relationship and God and our relationship with each other. Best described in these 2 words, fear and shame. It isn't long before we're hiding from God. It isn't long before we're hiding from each other in fear and shame. But God steps in, Act 3, as our Redeemer. He steps into the story as a God of grace, as a God of love, as a God as He does in our story over and over and over again, as a God with a plan. He steps in and He calls in Genesis chapter 12 and 15, He calls a man by the name of Abraham. Says to Abraham, who we now know as Father Abraham. He wasn't yet a father, but He says, through you, I'm going to begin my work of redemption. You will become a father, the father of a nation. And out of that nation, what we now know of 200 years later, they enter a period of silence. And it's out of that silence that the hero of our story is born. That God steps in, not just through a vision of what things could be, not just through a purpose or a plan, but in Himself, in the person of Jesus, to reset the whole thing as the great act of redemption, that He would restore us to our dignity as His children and into our purpose, playing a part in what God is continuing to do in our world. Jesus becomes the hero because the whole story is ultimately about Him. We find our place in this story when we trust Jesus. We trust the work of Jesus. And that ultimately, as we trust that what He did when He went to the cross, when His blood was spilled, that becomes the payment for our sin. We no longer live in the brokenness. We no longer live with the shame and the fear that we hold on to between each other, between our God, because Jesus has healed us. He begins in our hearts by putting our individual stories back together. He does this because he forgives us when we trust him. He not only forgives us, but he frees us to enter his story. And he does this by filling us with his very life, with his very spirit, with his very passion and desire in the world. Now, an interesting thing happens right here about Matthew chapter 16, where Jesus kind of foreshadows, which really gets us down the road to where we find ourselves today. And we find Jesus in this setting with his disciples talking about really the simple question of who Jesus is. And Jesus kind of, who do people say I am? Ultimately, he looks at his disciples like he looks at us today with sort of the big question, who do you say I am? Probably shocked Jesus, but Peter actually steps up with the right answer. We don't exactly know how Peter put the whole thing together, except we are told that it's revealed to him by his Father in heaven. Peter's answer sounds something like this. As he looks back at trying to answer Jesus' question, who is he? He says, Jesus, you're it. You are the one that pulls the whole story together. You are the Messiah. You're the one we've been waiting for. You're the promised fulfillment of God. You are the Son of God, our Messiah, our hope. And Jesus looks at him and says, you're right. You got it right this time, Peter. Well done. But then on that truth, what Jesus proclaims is what brings us to ultimately where we sit today. Because Jesus says it's on that foundation, the truth that he is Messiah, the Son of God, that God will build his church. Now, we think church, sometimes we think building. What Jesus said in that text is, I'm going to build my assembly, my gathering of people, because they will come and they will trust in me, this gathering of people, of worshipers. And as they trust in me, I will forgive them. I'll free them to my plan. I'll fill them with my spirit. And as I do that, I will restore them to their ultimate purpose in this world, free from sin, and restore to what they were created to be. And it's the church then that Jesus goes on to say that the very gates of hell will not stand against it. He makes this amazing proclamation to this small group of people, probably huddled in an upper room. But as we sit here in Sonora, some 2,000 years after Jesus made that sort of probably confusing declaration, in a church, as those gathered to worship, as those gathered who understand what it feels like and what it is to be forgiven, freed, and filled by the very Spirit of God, we know that Jesus' prediction was pushing us into this certain history. The church is not the end of the story. While it's the part we find ourselves, the end is what we call the consummation. That is that Jesus is coming back, not as God's sacrificial lamb as he did the first time, but as his conquering lion. And as the Lion of God re-enters the scene, we see him coming as victor, where every hurt is healed, every hope is ultimately realized. And it's into that future that we live. It's into that future that we hope. So there's the story of God in a few short minutes. May we find our place in God's story, living the purposes, living the plan of God in our day.